My name is Agnes Hankerson, and this is the distinctiveness of the Old South. For a very long time, people disputed about the differences that separated the South from the rest of the U.S. Most of the arguments focused on the climate and geography. The reason why is because both the climate and the geography were of benefit to the South, thus making them able to cultivate and grow crops such as cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, rice, and indigo. The South was simpler than the North. The South only counted with a few banks, railroads, factories, schools, and a few large cities. What made the South most distinctive was their expanding system of race-based slavery. John Cottton called it the South the peculiar institution. John invented the phrase as a technique to prevent Southerners from using the word slave, making the phrase unique to the South. Social status and unity was important for whites, as it was their way to establish class differences. Poor whites who did not own any slaves could still claim racial superiority over slaves. Thomas Reid Cobb, an attorney from Georgia, explained that due to the race-based slavery, whites felt that they belonged to a higher class. Regardless of who was the slave owner, the whites always felt they were not part of an inferior race and they were freeborn citizens. All of it because social status was very important for the whites. The Old South had a high proportion of native-born Americans. Only a few Europeans migrated to the South after the Revolution, mostly because of the geography. Most immigrants made it to the North due to the cheap shipping routes coming from Britain and Europe. Immigrant laborers were poor, forcing them to stay in the North because they could not afford to travel to the South. They were also where they could not compete with slave labor. An editor from North Carolina wrote, "The Southerners are a mythological people, creative half out of a dream and half out of slander, who live in a still legendary land." Rumors among white Southerners around the 19th century led them to believe that the South was both different and better than the North. Based on that rumor, Southerners created a self-image of distinctiveness and superiority. Even to the present, some Southerners continue to cultivate that same pride to try to keep the South separated from the rest of the nation. To justify the slavery from Northern critics, Southerners claim that the region was morally superior. Based on the myth, it was said that the South had kind planters who provide food, clothing, shelter, and security to their slaves. The Southerners blamed the North of being occupied by materialistic and heartless bankers and factory owners and accused them of treating their workers, worse than slaves. John Callan claimed that the quality of life for free people of color in the North was worse since they banned slavery versus the South standard living among African Americans that he claimed that had improved greatly in every aspect. In the mythic version of the Old South, they defend and justify slavery, claiming that it was of a benefit for both the slave and the owners. Novelist Mary Henderson Eastman wrote in Aunt Philip's Cabin or Southern Life as It Is in 1852. She explained that slavery was necessary for the South and that the slaves were content as their owners were humane and kind to them. The South continues to portray an image of having the perfect gentlemen who own guns, horses, and they love to hunt. The addition of the military helped to enhance the self-gratifying image of the South. Not only they created an image for the men, but also for the women in the South as well. They were believed to have beautiful young bellas and ladies well-mannered, kind, and untroubled, living in a romantic world of white column mansions. Abolitionists from the North recognized the myth of the South as one that was darker. They imagined the region was built on an immoral economic system where they abuse and exploit the slaves, and they also relocate Native Americans. Planters were seen as opportunists who became rich trading slaves and planting and selling cotton. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a Northern abolitionist, described the planters of the South as abusive, cunning capitalists who constantly and violently abused slaves, even raping the enslaved women. She explains how they separate the families by selling the slaves down the river to do extremely hard work in the Louisiana sugar and rice plantations. She said they treated the slaves like livestock, like cattle. In 1830, an English woman who was traveling to the South talked about the fear of the slaves in Virginia and Maryland. She said they were fearful of being sold and sent to the South. She said most slaves were terrified of the sugar plantations from Louisiana and the Georgia and North and South Carolina rice grounds. The South was also known as the Many South, as the South was defined by two souls, two hearts, and two minds. The Old South included 3 different subsections with different patterns of economic development and diverging degrees of commitment to slavery. During the first half of the 19th century, the southern states developed based on cotton production by Negroes. Because slaves were so efficient producing cotton, by 1860, they count for almost half of the population in the South. In the states of the Upper South, they had more agricultural variety. Not only they had plantations, but they also had yeoman farms. Yeoman farms were small family farms where crops were grown for household use. In the mountains of Virginia, the Eastern Carolinas, and Tennessee, and northern Georgia, slavery didn't exist, but only because the climate and soil were not suitable. By 1860, slavery slowing disappeared in the states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri because cotton didn't prosper there. Thanks to that, 90% of black population of Delaware and half of Maryland were free. In conclusion, the distinctiveness of the South was just a myth, an image created by the white man to ensure superiority and power. Slaves were exploited and abused daily and even killed. There was no such a thing as a kind plantation owner. It was all a myth and a lie. They did not take care of the slaves, and they never had any intentions to really care for them. All they cared about was to use them for their personal gain and prosperity. Without the slaves, There will be no cotton, no tobacco. They will not be able to survive. It is the reason why they created the myth as a way of justification of their wrongdoing.
Hello, my name is Irani Caballero, and I will be talking about the cotton economy in the South. In the 19th century, cotton was the most profitable crop in the southern states. It was really easy for a white male to become rich in the South. All he needed was to get land, cotton seeds, and slaves to work on fields. And although it was a profitable product, it required harsh labor and harsh conditions. The warm climate and rain in the South made it perfect for planting cotton. It seemed like everyone benefited from cotton except for slaves, starting from the planters who grew rich to merchants who sold it and the people wearing it. British inventors soon developed textile mills to transform the cotton into cloth. It was still a hard job to remove the seeds from the cotton balls. This led to the creation of the first cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney. By 1820, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia produced 2/3 of the nation's cotton. Unfortunately, overplanting and soil exhaustion caused growth to decline. In 1860, the Cotton Kingdom stretched from the Carolinas to Illinois. The Mississippi River became the highway to transporting bales to New York to England. In 1860, 2/3 of the richest Americans lived in the South from the cotton economy, driving the majority of the national economy and industrial revolution.
Hello, my name is Ronnie Rupertus. I'm going to talk about Southern white culture. In the South, the region is known as the Bible Belt. There were a few different white society groups. At the top, you had the planters' elites. The elites had 20 or more slaves and owned a fairly large plantation. The elites held all the power, from political to social influence. The planters only made up about 4% of the white population. Other white people owned a few slaves, but most owned none. Majority of the white people were literally called plain white folks. The plain white folks were just regular farmers who raised corn, cotton, hogs, and chickens. They also were willing to move to the west. The plantation mistress was in charge of the house and all of the house slaves. Even the white people who didn't own any slaves were scared of the competition it would cause if slavery were to be abolished. The white society deeply enjoyed the privilege slavery provided them with. The plantations that were worked and lived on were antebellum architecture, which is basically the large houses with the big white columns. Other houses were influenced by either French or Greek style of architecture. Cotton was one of the biggest cash crops the plantations had. Other crops included things like tobacco, sugar, indigo, and rice.
Hello there. My name is Valerie Majano, and I will be discussing the Southern Black culture. As the slave population grew, slaveholders developed a slave system. Depending on the states where the slave lived, certain regulations and restrictions were applied. Things got so strict that slaves could not leave their owner's household without permission nor stay after dark without an identification card. Slaves were treated so harshly. They could get abused, tortured, and could not do anything about it. Black slaves could not get legally married, own a firearm, nor hit a white man even if it were in self-defense. In other words, slaves were treated like animals, all dignity stripped away from them. Despite the harsh restrictions and brutalities, the enslaved managed to find sanctuary in their communities and culture. Within the boundaries of slavery system, slaves forged bonds, diversions, and religion. Slaves had no rights whatsoever. The whites feared that the slaves could surpass them and could be superior one day if given the chance, and that is why slaves were whipped if misbehaved to keep them in line. Slaves could not be educated. Learning how to read and write was banned in fear that the slaves would write notes to plan a revolt. All those restrictions led slaves to gather in secret, in what they called night meetings. It usually occurred after midnight. They would drink stolen alcohol, dance, tell stories of the promised land, once freedom being freedom. At these meetings, they would also express their unique religion, which was a mixture of African, Caribbean, and Christianity. Their religion was their hope, lifting their souls and releasing their built-up emotions. They also believed in concepts such as spirits, magic, charms, and even conjuring. A conjurer to them was what we would call a witch doctor, a person who could constantly heal someone or do the opposite and harm someone. Once the night was over, they had to go back into reality and face the rough day ahead of them. A South Carolina planter named William Johnson explained in 1815 that the interest of the owner is to obtain from his slaves his labor and increase in their numbers. The book American mentioned how a male and female slave were locked in a cabin to procreate babies. Once a woman passed menopause, their workload increased, and they were expected to do as much as the male slaves accomplished. It consisted of cutting trees, slaughtering animals, and picking cotton. Once they reached the granny stage, they were in charge of taking care of the children. Some grannies were nurses and midwives. Moreover, depending what part of the South slaves were living in, had a great influence on how good or bad they were treated. Slaves living in the southern cities were better fed and clothed than the slaves who lived in farms and plantations. Slaves could get a job in the city and keep a small portion. Male slaves had jobs as carpenters, showmakers, barbers, bricklayers, and female slaves had jobs as house servants, seamstresses. Many saved their money to buy their freedom, or some were just born free blacks. The African American slaves that were free were called free persons of color. The free persons of color had more rights than slaves. They could get married, own property, including owning their own slaves, but they could not vote, own weapons, nor attend a white church service. However, they were not viewed the same, nor treated the same. Many free blacks lived in constant fear that one day they could get kidnapped and sold into slavery. Just like it happened to Solomon Northup, a free black man born in New York City with a wife and 3 children. Solomon was kidnapped in 1845 by slave traders and was transported to Washington, D.C. first and then to New Orleans. He was sold to an awful, repulsive white man. He spent 12 years as a slave. They actually made a movie showing the harsh environment and conditions Solomon went through and how he managed to get his freedom back.